All right, let's get started. And Nathan, I see you posted asking if somebody would take notes, so I can take notes. And
It's tough to take notes into MC though, so I'll just do it again.
oh, okay. All right. Let's see.
Why don't we have Jenna's software take a transcript and then we will pass it through ChatGPT? Jenna, is there any way of having Ardo or whoever sit on Discord and record?
No, those tools only hook up to Zoom calls, so a weird gate there. But Anuraj is recording, and we can shoot the audio over as a separate step. We could even create a Zap for some automation. Anuraj, you and I can get together on that if you like.
That's the fifth way, these AIs can help us in life.
That's a really good idea.
Yeah, let's try and figure out an automated workflow because I do think note taking is an annoying enough chore that nobody will easily volunteer, and rotating it may be pretty high friction. But adding an extra workflow will also be high friction, so kind of have to figure out which one will actually work.
Well,
But
there are some plugins which actually automatically transcribe in the YouTube channels. I haven't tried them yet. You can try it later on.
and I think the call bot or something also at least records Discord and maybe transcribes as well. So yeah, worth a little bit of investigation. But yeah, let's discuss the paper of today. The is Chat GP or GPT-4 showing sparks of general intelligence. And why don't we start with Brian today and go down?
Yeah, it's, I don't know. I'm kind of new to like the AGI stuff and haven't thought too much about like cognition and intelligence and like what it all means. But like reading this, I kind of was thinking that I like all this GPT stuff and AI in general just seems to be like quote unquote deep generalists in like the Twitter thread posting polymath kind of guy vein. Like it knows a lot about a lot of things, but to the average person interacting with it, it knows a little bit. Like you ask it a question and it'll give you a very surface level response. And if you don't know enough to ask follow up questions or like the right kind of prompts, you're really not going to get any deeper knowledge out of it. So I guess to me it feels like whatever intelligence is, these models are pretty damn close to like the human capacity to process information and make sense out of it. But at the same time, it's feeling to me like bits aren't and maybe have never really been the bottleneck in making things happen. So a lot, like I read a lot of this and I'm just kind of sort of like, so what? Like I guess it helps us develop better models of the world to make better decisions about atomic things that are, expensive to do and have high opportunity costs and have, greater chance of ruin. But it's starting just to feel like so what to me. And I kind of come to that last week. I was playing with the GPT-4, and I was like trying to think like what could I actually use this for? Like I can make software and write code and design things, and like most of my time is spent sitting in front of a computer. So it should have like some utility to me, and I'm like struggling to find a use for it. And I don't know if that's because like I just don't have the ambition, or I don't like want it to work, or because some other reason. But like the best I've come up with is like things that you could write little scripts for, or regex, like just transforming data sets into other things or whatever. I'm sure there's more, but like there are like small tiny one-off things that I could see it being useful for. I don't know if like those one-off things happen frequently enough for you to like develop prompt working in a prompt form is a good skill. And then on the other end, there's like big projects that are now attainable for one person to do. But then like I have questions of like how do you maintain a system that you didn't know enough to build it yourself? Like how does something built with AI look in 5 years or something? I don't know, but I probably have more questions than answers at this point. But are we passing down? Grigory, I think.
I didn't have time to read the whole article. It's pretty long, but I read the beginning and a couple of sections. What is interesting is at the very beginning there is emphasis on discovering the limitations, and in my view, it's a good thing. Even so, they kind of admit that intelligence is a very elusive concept. They're trying to define it somehow, but the definition includes words among other things. What are these other things? It's really hard to figure out. It can be anything. So you have a list of things, and then you add there are other things as well, and basically your definition breaks down. And the definition is very broad, so there are many different vectors you can take. You can look at how it plans, at how it solves problems, how it learns, and so on and so forth. But because of that, because there are many vectors in many different directions, it's kind of very difficult to measure or to find the measure of it. It can be a little bit better at planning, but a little bit worse at comprehending complex ideas. And what do we make out of? But then again, definition of AGI is as broad as the definition of intelligence. So it came from the aspirations from moving from the narrow AI to a broader current version. And this desire to make it broad comes back to, I believe, early research efforts in the area. So it's driven by nostalgia most of the time, not by discovery. So instead of looking forward and trying to figure out what it should do, we are looking back and trying to figure out whether it can do something that I don't know, 40 or 50 years ago we thought it could do. And again, they have difficulties to measure GPT-4 because the data set is very broad, is all encompassing, and the model saw everything. And in some cases, what we see as an intelligence can be just memorization. Um, the question I have when they discuss the different tasks that GPT-4 and ChatGPT mastered or perform, uh, but really, have they mastered the tasks? And do they even care? Do the GPT-4 and ChatGPT really care about mastering them? In other words, are the questions that the authors of the article ask in the systems the right questions to ask? Like, is it the right question to ask a system to draw a unicorn, or to prove a theorem, or to write a Platonic dialogue? Probably in, I don't know, 10 years from now, we would consider these tasks pretty stupid. Like if you ask a certain human to draw a unicorn using some primitive software, he or she would probably think that's pretty boring, or even stupid. And finally, probably it's a part of human intelligence to be bored by stupid, meaningless tasks. And this is how we make progress. We are getting bored by stupid, meaningless tasks, and we are looking for something to do which is less stupid and more meaningful. As for the second part of the question, how do I want to use it in my life? I definitely don't want to teach it, because I don't have the data set, but I want to learn from it. And again, it's an interesting question. How do you learn from a genius that knows everything, but probably has all the human traits of a genius? So not very nice person, I would say. And my answer is by engaging in a meaningful dialogue with a thing which should be interesting not only to me but to the system as well. But how do I know that the conversation or dialogue is interesting to the system? It seems like an interesting problem to solve. That's my part, and I will pass it on to Jenna.
I think Jenna was in listen-only mode for the first round. So I think we would be skipping over to Kyle.
Oh, sorry. This is my first time joining one of these, actually. So what's the convention here? What am I doing?
So we normally start with a prompt. So Venkat had offered a prompt earlier about considering second-order impacts. What are the possible practical ways to integrate AI into your work life? So generally, we move in one direction, up or down the list, and talk about our impressions of the reading, and then our thoughts on how the reading relates to the prompt.
Gotcha. Did I think interesting to say? Yeah, secondary impacts. I mean, there's like gazillions. I don't know how many firm thoughts there, but integrating into your AI into your work life. I've been playing a lot with that since like ChatGPT came out last fall, and it's quite hit and miss still. A lot of the normal stuff I do Google searching for, it like sort of can do it sometimes, but it's not reliable enough to be interesting. Probably the most useful is stuff that's been completely swamped by spam. So like, we're doing some traveling soon, so it's actually pretty useful just to like ask ChatGPT travel questions, because like you search for that, you get like 1,000 blog posts from random people that meander everywhere, where ChatGPT just gives you a nice summarized answer. So that's pretty nice. But yeah, like programming stuff. So I'm a programmer, so I've asked a lot of programming questions, and it's sometimes helpful, but like takes a lot of review time to figure out if it's helpful or not. So it's pretty hit or miss. But it's fun. I enjoy seeing what it comes up with, because it's always kind of surprising. So I still ask a lot of questions, even if it's not necessarily a good use of time. I think Copilot, like GitHub's Copilot, is probably better. I mean, I haven't signed up for that, but that's probably a better interface, just because it's like in your flow, and it's just like showing you stuff, suggestions, and you can, and they're shorter snippets, so it's easier to evaluate and accept or reject on the fly. But yeah, I'm very curious on the impact of OpenAI's plugins, because yeah, that actually makes ChatGPT more useful potentially, because it can do stuff, integrate with like live sources of data, and reason about it. Some of the demos have been quite compelling, but yeah, I don't know. It's definitely deep in the upward swing, very very steep upward swing of a hype cycle. So it's a little hard to see where all this stuff's going to shake out, because people are cherry picking the coolest examples. But yeah, how generalizable are these? How actually useful are these day to day life? Until everything settles down a bit, it's hard to know. But it's definitely, there's definitely useful stuff, and I definitely use it constantly.
So the convention in these calls is to pass to the next person down the list usually. So in your case, you would pass to Mayor.
Thank you.
Take it away, Mayor.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. And the reason is because this question has been bothering me. And I do IP. And the question is, what will IP work look like in the age of generative AI? So I didn't finish a presentation, but there's some parts. And right now, when I'm not looking at it, how will it affect my work? I'm looking at it as the opposite of the internet. The internet allowed us to find anything. And now we can find the holistic, the zeitgeist of what's going on. And I'm not even sure what to ask, but I'm starting to explore that. Well, back to how it will affect my job, because that was a prompt. So first I made a list of significant technological revolutions that I've been through that's affected my job. Just as an example, when I started, most patent attorneys did not use word processors. And there's a lot of things that happened online, search engines, the rise of offshoring work to India, systems which automatically discover new chemicals that can work, Web 2.0 with things like evaluation of the quality of the people you're working with in the patent office, 24/7 connection to the office and to the clients on all of these, Slack, WhatsApp, and so on. Each one of these made a big difference, but of course also generative AI will. So why does it matter, especially to patent attorneys? And I'm sure each one of you has the answer for their own job. So we deal in ideas, but we describe them using words. And GPT-4 is really, really good in generating words and in processing words. Just to give you a feeling for it, one of the examples I have in the paper at the beginning is write a proof in the form of a rhyme. So one of the tasks I give trainee patent attorneys is to describe an invention in a, um, 5-sentence, 5-line rhyme. And of course, now that you can just do it in ChatGPT. I identified the following different categories of mattering. So there's ideas, the number of ideas and the type of ideas and the availability is going to change. The way I do the work is going to change. I'm going to write, the computer's going to write. Training new people will hopefully now be very, very different. If I can have ChatGPT review their work and give them feedback, that means I can train more people faster and better. The way the clients work is going to change, how we talk to clients. Now I can send them a whole bunch of data and expect ChatGPT to be used as a search engine or an explanation engine to explain what's going on. It's more convenient for everybody. It's exactly the opposite with not my, but the client's competitors. Now a competitor can much better understand what we're doing. So if before you had the businessmen would look at the patents and not understand what's going on and have to hire a lawyer, and that would slow them down, now the businessman can tell GPT-4, please explain to me, what this patent portfolio looks like. There's going to be new needs, which I don't even know what they are yet, and the way in which we protect ideas, okay, that's really a legal matter, is going to change, but we've all seen this is definitely a problem. I don't know how many of you read about Stanford copying the abilities of ChatGPT using $600, but basically they used GPT-4 to generate question answers as training material, and then they took some other LLM and gave it these pairs, and it was just as good as ChatGPT in applying them. And I also have some particular examples. So generating text is now going to be really, really easy, but understanding it will be more difficult because a lot of it will be garbage generated to look nice by generative AI. There's issues here which are very specific to my work, like what does it mean to be obvious and who's an owner, but there's definitely going to be new types of companies. We have to figure out how people who don't do AI are going to change. And from a business perspective, this software is good enough to write a bad patent. And I've tried it out. It can even invent a bad invention. So clients, instead of having a continuum of quality from the worst patent attorney to the best patent attorney, will now be forced to decide between a very, very cheap, low-quality job, hopefully it's low quality, from a chat, and an expensive, high-quality job from a human. And that's going to look different. And last but not least, I have a list of open problems that I have in my work. And obviously, each one of them I have to ask, now that we have ChatGPT, can I expect inroads into solving the problems? And just as an example, getting clients to write disclosures is really, really difficult. Somebody has an idea, but they can't write it down. But now with ChatGPT, I can give them a recipe, and they can talk to ChatGPT and generate a disclosure quickly and easily. So that is what I had to say, except for one last point. When I thought about new skills that I would have to develop in order to do my job in another year, then here's what I came up with so far. One of them is prompt engineering, and specifically context sheets, meaning what do I put into the prompt so that the GPT will understand what's important for it to know. dealing with the type of output from ChatGPT, which, like I said, it's very authoritative and it's difficult to find where it's making a mistake. There's a whole slew of types of search which are now possible, which were not really possible before, which we're going to have to invent and use them. Like I said before, training. And on the flip side, maybe learning how to do my job will look very differently if somebody else does most of it. So it's not just training somebody to do what I do, but training somebody to do something new. So that's what I had, and I am passing it on to Nathan.
Okay. I think we're getting close to the top of the hour, so I'm going to try to be brief. I think my thought with reading this paper, I mean, I think from previous conversations, you should know that all know that I'm very much sort of an AGI skeptic. I didn't see a lot in this paper that makes me reconsider that stance. I feel like there's a lot of confirmation bias going on in it, and a lot of asking very mushy questions. That said, I mean, the tool is genuinely impressive, and I think suggests something very interesting about the symbolic space that humans operate in, which I think is probably the same space that the large language models are operating in. After all, they're being asked to analyze the human space rather than, the real world. And I think to get something interesting, I think you'd have to do with something like what Venkat is always talking about. You need something embodied, because otherwise you're just sort of running around people in our collective id. And I think what's interesting is that it sort of feels like it's suggesting that there's a notch. We're looking at something a notch up from that classic paper about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics and the physical sciences. And I think we might be looking at and saying, no, actually the problem is the unreasonable effectiveness in language in describing reality. Because it is really sort of looking like all of these things, all of these human symbolic systems are kind of isomorphic to each other, but they're also really, really good at explaining what's happening in the world. Unreasonably good, better than we would expect it to be. And I think I find that very interesting, but it's a very different point than what the authors are thinking about or trying to make. Mostly, it just seems like we've got a very, very good symbolic manipulator. We've got a symbolic manipulator that we can give goals that's very, very powerful. But it's like I think an analogy I made before is like it's mistaking the ship's computer for data in Star Trek. And I think it's important that we keep that in mind. In terms of the prompt and what are interesting things with this and sort of second order effects, I mean, for me, I think the most interesting thing is around automation. I'm not much of a coder, despite the fact that I work with computers a lot. So being able to describe what I want to have happen and have a tool create that for me seems very, very, very powerful. And I would really, really love to use that at work. I can think of ways of saying, hey, I want to chain together a set of tools that are just like slightly beyond the cost benefit for me doing it myself. But if I can just ask, that seems really, really powerful. The problem with a lot of this, though, particularly with my job, is that I'm a work as basically with a consulting group, and there's a lot of questions of confidentiality, particularly with the sorts of things that I handle. We're very, very careful about client data. Nobody's going to let me ask client relevant questions to ChatGPT 6.0 or whatever. So I think really and I think a lot of businesses are in this space too. I've not worked in a business that wasn't very, very nervous about handing off certain parts of its core data. I mean, even just to cloud services, let alone something that's going to really analyze them. So I think that we're really going to be looking at either much better data isolation, needing much better data isolation, or local models before this really takes off. So I think that's going to be a really big effect, and I think it's going to really, there's going to be a lot of excitement, and then things are going to kind of get really tamped down. And then once these things get to a point with hardware and software that you can start reasonably running them locally, or in a few boxes in a cloud that you manage, I think you'll start seeing a lot more business adoption at that point. So those are just some of my quick thoughts. I think I've talked a little bit too long, so I want to pass down to Stephen.
Sorry, I'm on listen mode.
Sorry, I missed that. I guess passing down to Venkat.
All right. The word that keeps bothering me each time I think of this is the word general. And I think people use it in a couple of different ways. What I like about this paper is that it upfront defines general in the way I think is more reasonable, which is can basically do anything a human can do. But if you participate in the broader conversation, you'll notice that AGI is generally used in the sense of general equals God, as in it has like omnipotent and omniscient levels of like knowledge and agency. So I just wanted to point that out. So this is a more reasonable thing, like human equivalence as generality, and I read that as humans are actually not very general intelligences. We are extremely adapted to our particular biological niches in this particular planet. And we may be more general compared to insects, but that's not saying much about generality as such. But okay, given that the question of is this like generality in the useful sense? And I think the answer is yes and no. There's definitely a big piece of human style generality that this kind of model covers. But the no part is, if you look at sort of the leftovers, like what doesn't it do that then in the prompt feedback loop you have to compensate for? So the couple of big things that this paper sort of underlines, and especially because it's GPT-4, not GPT-3, I was hoping to see improvement on these vectors, but I didn't. So one is improved ability to not hallucinate. So it's not embodied, so you can't expect much. But still, I mean, there's so many unreasonable effectiveness things going on here, like Nathan pointed out, that maybe somehow magically language itself has enough information that it can start to like disambiguate hallucinated things from real things, but apparently not. So on that front, my reaction to this kind of stuff is this is not necessarily a very smart genius person per se, but it's like a smart genius person who has gone psychotic and is wandering homeless on the street, and it's ranting and it's processing the output of that person or this GPT-4 model is as hard as like processing basically reality for yourself. So the point of that is think of like a normal task that's partly automated, leaving some part for you to do, and how smart you have to be to do the remainder part. So take, for example, like a dumb calculator that does arithmetic 100% accurately 100% of the time. So once you have a calculator, you basically don't have to be good at arithmetic at all. So it never goes wrong, and whatever is left for you to do when you solve the arithmetic part of a problem is sort of like a reduced subset of the general intelligence problem. So something like, once you have a calculator, calculating the tip is no longer hard. When you go out to the restaurant, if you ask 15, 20, 25%, it'll calculate correctly. But then the only part left is deciding how much of a tip you want to leave. And that's a softer social problem of how good was the service, what are the norms around here, how much am I expected to tip, and then you leave the calculation part to the computer. So the point is the part that's left for the human is actually like meaningfully reduced. You can be more dumb in proportion to how much smarter the computer is. Now, unfortunately, with AI, this doesn't seem to be true. So, for example, take the problem of hallucination detection and correction. The problem with that is it may do most of the work in generating, like, the words for like a 5,000 word essay on something. But you can't afford to be less smart in order to edit that essay. You have to be as smart as you originally had to be to just write the whole essay yourself. So instead of writing a 5,000 essay with a certain level of intelligence, you now have to edit that 5,000 word essay with the same level of intelligence because you're doing this kind of like full model complexity task of checking it for hallucinations, right? So that's as hard as just writing the essay yourself. And in some cases, you would argue that it's actually just easier to just write the 5,000 word essay yourself. So at least as a writer, um, editing is fundamentally harder than writing. And if I'm actually feeling lazy, it's actually less effort for me to just write the damn thing than to check another output for hallucinations. And I suspect programmers feel the same way about uh, coding, where effectively you have to check code output for bugs and especially weird bugs, which are different kinds of corner cases than human programmers would make. So you can't like rely on like the familiar patterns of bug testing human output. And I would argue that that task requires the same full amount of intelligence as just writing the code yourself. In fact, probably more. There's, I think, a famous law that states that debugging a program is harder than writing it. And I agree. I've always found debugging much harder. So in some ways, this might make a lot of the first dump of getting the syntax basically right fine. And I did try this a couple of times. And yes, so long as it's making simple mistakes, the programming effort has gone down. Um, but if it's detecting subtle bugs, I think it would be harder. And I can't afford to be any less intelligent in writing code as opposed to like editing code. And I think this pattern is repeating itself. Same thing with like, paintings and generated art. Can you detect subtle problems with the imagery and so forth? But, okay, so the second order effect part of the prompt, I think Stack Overflow is a good example. So there's people complaining that this thing has learned on Stack Overflow. So ironically, I was just, while listening to people talking, I wanted to make a point about pre-training. And I Googled pre-training, and the first answer that comes up is Stack Overflow. So the lowest level loop in training models is, all the decisions the model training people do, like, how to pre-train, how to like do the weights on the backprop and like all the little fine tuning that they do. That's the innermost loop. The second order loop is this RLHF, as they call it, the reinforcement learning with human feedback loop. So that's the second order loop going on. And then the third order loop, once people start using it, is of course the prompt loop, right? And you have to ask in second order terms, how are these loops going to collapse? Already we know that the first lowest level loop can collapse into AI itself, so the model can train its own successors. The second order of like human feedback reinforcement learning to make it, not answer dangerous questions or not make dangerous mistakes. That part, it's not clear to me that it can ever collapse based on the lack of embodiment. But the prompt loop can collapse. Like if it sees enough prompt and response data, it can probably learn to auto prompt, so self prompt. But one of the effects will be that, for example, Stack Overflow might become an unsustainable website. People would start just using GPT and stop posting questions and answers on Stack Overflow. So that data source dries up. But then what happens? Either the newer generations of the model start to collapse, or it gets good enough at learning from its own coding examples. So it generates code, people give it prompt feedback, it improves the code and so forth. So that data that's being presumably stored somewhere becomes a good or better substitute to Stack Overflow answers. Even though Stack Overflow owners might be upset that the platform is gone, there's no real loss and the program is actually doing fine. So that's what I think of as the second order effects. But I think So what's going to happen, I think, is all these second order effects are going to change the nature of the things it's training from. So anything that was used as training data is going to be transformed by the second order effects that kind of disrupt the creation of such data. So like if it's learning from short stories, people will stop writing the kinds of short stories it's trained on, because then it becomes generic, right? So that's going to happen. But I think what so far I don't see a way to change is how do you get out of like the corner cases requiring the full intelligence to handle as the original task itself. So it's not actually lowering the amount of intelligence we need to use it. So that to me suggests something interesting either needs to change or interesting things will happen with what humans do. So the kinds of like inventory that Mayer took of his existing tasks, I think you have to step back and ask, once you take second order effects into account and the fact that you have to be equally smart just to use the output, are the definitions of those tasks even going to remain the same? And it's not clear to me how to think about that. But, okay, oh crap, we went on too long. Sorry, if people can stay a couple of minutes, I think only Anant is left. So.
Thank you. I'll try to keep this quick. I mean, like, I guess I echo the similar thoughts that other others had in terms of the general intelligence. I found the title of the paper a little provocative, and so I sort of focused my attention, like based on engineering intuition, on like the sort of problems the current models, the current paradigms have, and sort of I focused my reading around it. And specifically, I found the mathematical reasoning part of the paper was quite interesting, and they sort of defined the dimensions that they evaluate the mathematical reasoning in: creative reasoning, technical proficiency, and sort of critical reasoning, all like different aspects of problem solving, mathematical problem solving. And it seems to do well in sort of high school level mathematics problems, but it breaks pretty easily. It struggles with, for example, they discuss about exponential functions, which only works when it's like context dependent. And even like a simple question of figuring out the number of prime numbers between, say, 70 to 150, the answer comes up wrong. And this sort of, they attribute this sort of outputs to the linear thinking of the model, which is like the model is based on the next word prediction. So for it obviously fails at sort of problem solving, thinking multiple steps ahead, and in choosing the right path to getting to the solution. The examples they use of like the physiological power rate of a StarCraft player, now accounting for different actions per minute, the model do seem to, this is like a mathematical modeling of a real world scenario, but not directly dictated by mathematics itself. So it sort of has to use comparisons and analogs to create the model, and it did a decent job of it. And the another one I found interesting was the Fermi questions. It's sort of GPT-4 seems to make a better attempt at answering or thinking about Fermi questions as compared to GPT-3, at least as in the paper. And it makes a series of assumptions. It sort of establishes the thought process it goes through in attempting to answer such type of questions, which I found interesting. But anyway, so thinking about the sort of bottlenecks or like the problems with the current modeling, I sort of went into the rabbit hole of looking at other models, and I found that Minerva is a model from Google, which is like specifically designed for solving quantitative reasoning problems with different sort of promptings as chain of thought or Scratchpad, or like, and they were specifically trained on scientific papers that contains LaTeX code, which seem to perform better at these sort of mathematical logical reasoning problems than, say, GPT-4. So again, like general intelligence seems like a bit of a jump, and it can't even calculate the sort of prime numbers between two real numbers, positive real numbers. But I mean, there's different aspects of it that I found interesting. Another paper that I found in relation to improving the current paradigm of learning is sort of called, the paper was called Reflexion, and it looks at, or at least it discusses, methods of using dynamic memory and self-reflection as a way for training. It's again, the idea is that the next word prediction fails really simply in a lot of very simple basic reasoning problems, and sort of having a dynamic memory and ability to iterate to a solution is going to be important, and that seems to be an area of research that folks are working on. In terms of the real world, where it can be used or where I think it can be used, I found this new article by Jeffrey Litt on the malleable software in the age of LLMs, and he was specifically focusing on end user programming, and I find it very interesting in sort of how to these GPT-4 type language models large language models seems to be really good at sort of instant creativity, way better than humans in some degree, at least better than me in terms of being creative in certain aspects. So I was thinking that there are a lot of nuisance. Somebody mentioned about booking air travel tickets or restaurant reservations. These are like requires some creative thinking given the constraints of date, time, distance, budget, and so on and so forth. I feel like these are some dimensions along which the sort of language models can be packaged with some sort of end user programming capability around it, and sort of Jeffrey Litt's article discusses at length about this. So I'll stop there. That's me.
All right. So I think that's everybody. So this seems like an interesting discussion, and what I can try to do is find a suitable provocation for next week, so we can kind of continue it in the same stream and have more opportunity to think about this. So if you can think of a good read, do that. So we are 7 minutes over, so I guess we should stop now, and we'll see each other next week.